In 2019, a small factory in Ohio that made fighter jet parts suddenly went dark. Not from a cyber attack, not from a power outage. They ran out of rare earth elements, and there was only one place in the world they could get more: China. Everyone talks about how much American debt China holds, about treasury bonds and economic warfare, about the $1 trillion owed. But while we've been obsessing over those numbers, something far more fundamental has shifted beneath our feet. The real power in the 21st century doesn't come from who holds whose debt. It comes from who controls the materials that make modern life possible, and the infrastructure that connects our world, and the technology that powers our future. This is the story of how China quietly became the gatekeeper to the technologies we cannot live without. And how America, the nation that invented so many of these innovations, now finds itself asking permission to use them. Let's start with something you've probably never heard of, but touch every single day: rare earth elements. Despite the name, they're not actually rare. They're scattered throughout the Earth's crust in relatively abundant quantities. What makes them special is how difficult and dirty they are to extract and refine. And what makes them irreplaceable is that they're inside almost everything electronic you own. Your smartphone contains at least 8 different rare earth elements. The screen uses europium and terbium to create colors. The speakers use neodymium for powerful magnets in a tiny space. The vibration motor, the camera's autofocus, even the circuitry that manages your battery, all depend on these elements with strange names most people can't pronounce. But it goes far beyond your phone. Every electric vehicle needs about 200 pounds of rare earth elements for its motors and batteries. Wind turbines require over 1,000 pounds each. The F-35 fighter jet, America's most advanced warplane, needs about 900 pounds of rare earths per aircraft. Guided missiles, laser systems, radar, satellite communications, all of it relies on these materials. In the 1980s, America was the world's leading producer of rare earth elements. We mined them, refined them, and supplied them to the world. The Mountain Pass mine in California was the global center of rare earth production. American scientists led the research into their applications. American companies pioneered their use in advanced technologies. Then China made a strategic decision. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping said that the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. It wasn't a casual observation, it was a declaration of intent. China began investing billions into rare earth mining and processing. They subsidized their industry, absorbed the environmental costs that American companies couldn't bear under stricter regulations, and systematically undercut global prices. One by one, rare earth mines outside China became unprofitable and closed. The Mountain Pass mine shut down in 2002. Companies that relied on these materials found it cheaper and easier to source everything from China. By 2010, China controlled 97% of global rare earth production. Not because they had all the deposits, but because they were willing to do what others wouldn't. They accepted the toxic waste, the contaminated groundwater, the poison landscapes that come with rare earth refining. Then in 2010, China showed what that monopoly could mean. During a territorial dispute with Japan over some uninhabited islands, China quietly halted rare earth exports to Japan. No formal announcement, no trade war declaration, simply a quiet word to Chinese companies that export licenses would be delayed indefinitely. Japan's high-tech industries ground toward a standstill. The message was clear. Rare earths might be elements on the periodic table, but they were also leverage. The crisis passed, exports resumed, but the warning shot had been fired. America and other nations suddenly realized they had outsourced not just manufacturing, but strategic control over their most advanced technologies. Having your rival hold your debt is one thing. Having them control the materials you need to build weapon systems is quite another. Today, China's dominance has actually grown. They now control about 70% of global rare earth mining, but more importantly, they refine about 90% of the world's rare earths into usable materials. Even rare earths mined in other countries are often shipped to China for processing, because that's where the expertise and infrastructure exist. America has been trying to restart domestic production. The Mountain Pass mine reopened in 2018. There are new projects in Texas, Alaska, Wyoming. But here's the problem. Building a rare earth supply chain isn't just about digging elements out of the ground. It's about decades of accumulated knowledge in processing, refining, and manufacturing. It's about training engineers who understand these materials. It's about building factories that can turn raw ore into the specialized magnets and alloys that industries need. China didn't just build mines, they built an entire ecosystem. Universities that teach rare earth metallurgy, research institutes that develop new applications, supply chains that connect mines to refineries to manufacturers. When you're the company making electric motors, you don't just need neodymium, you need neodymium refined to exact specifications, formed into precisely shaped magnets, delivered on schedule. China can do all of that. Almost no one else can. And rare earths are just the beginning of this story. While America worried about treasury bonds, China was playing a much longer game across multiple technologies that will define the next century. Consider solar panels. In the early 2000s, American and European companies led solar panel innovation. German firms like Q-Cells dominated manufacturing. American companies pioneered new cell designs. Then China entered the market with massive government backing. They built enormous factories, drove down costs, and scaled up production faster than anyone thought possible. Today, China manufactures about 80% of the world's solar panels. They control most of the supply chain for polysilicon, the key material in solar cells. They dominate production of solar wafers, the thin slices that become solar cells. They lead in solar cell manufacturing and module assembly. If you're installing solar panels anywhere in the world, they almost certainly came from China or were made with Chinese materials. This matters because solar energy is supposed to be the future. It's the technology that will help nations reduce carbon emissions and achieve energy independence. Except it turns out that switching from dependence on Middle Eastern oil to dependence on Chinese solar panels is not really energy independence at all. It's just a new form of dependency. The same pattern emerges with batteries. Electric vehicles are the future of transportation. Every major automaker is racing to electrify their fleet. But building an electric car means building a battery, and battery supply chains run through China. China controls about 80% of global battery cell production. They refine about 70% of the world's lithium and cobalt, the key materials in lithium-ion batteries. They manufacture most of the world's battery cathodes and anodes. Even when lithium is mined in Australia or cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's usually shipped to China for refining. Chinese companies like CATL and BYD have become global battery powerhouses. They've achieved economies of scale that competitors struggle to match. They've vertically integrated their supply chains in ways that give them cost advantages. When Tesla builds cars in America, it often uses battery cells made by Chinese suppliers. American companies are trying to build domestic battery production. There are new factories going up in Michigan, Georgia, Tennessee. The government is offering billions in subsidies to encourage battery manufacturing on American soil. But once again, building a factory is one thing. Building the entire supply chain is something else entirely. The mines, the refineries, the component manufacturers, the technical expertise. China has spent 2 decades building all of that while America was focused elsewhere. Then there's 5G, the next generation of wireless technology that will connect everything from phones to cars to factories to entire cities. 5G isn't just faster internet. It's the infrastructure that will enable autonomous vehicles, smart cities, remote surgery, advanced manufacturing, and technologies we haven't even imagined yet. Whoever builds the 5G infrastructure will have enormous influence over how these technologies develop and who controls them. Huawei, a Chinese company, became the world leader in 5G equipment. They hold more 5G patents than any other company. They offer equipment that's both cheaper and, by some measures, more advanced than their Western competitors. By 2020, Huawei equipment was being installed in 5G networks across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The United States looked at this and saw a strategic nightmare. 5G networks are the nervous system of a modern economy. Having them built by a Chinese company, particularly one with alleged ties to the Chinese government, raised profound security concerns. Could Huawei equipment be used for espionage? Could it contain backdoors that would allow Chinese intelligence services to intercept communications? Could China shut down networks in a crisis? America launched a campaign to convince allies to ban Huawei from their 5G networks. Some agreed. Britain initially allowed Huawei, then reversed course. Australia banned them. Others stuck with Huawei because the alternatives from Nokia and Ericsson were more expensive and, in some cases, less capable. The debate over Huawei became a perfect symbol of the larger dilemma. When your rival makes the best or cheapest product in a critical technology, what do? You can ban it for security reasons, but then you're using inferior equipment and paying more. You can try to build alternatives, but that takes years and billions in investment. Meanwhile, the rest of the world might choose the Chinese option, leaving you isolated. This is where the treasury bond story starts to look almost quaint. Sure, China holds about $1 trillion in U.S. government debt. That sounds frightening until you remember that the total U.S. debt is about $36 trillion, and treasury bonds are considered one of the safest investments in the world. China buying American debt actually helps keep U.S. interest rates low. If China tried to dump its treasury holdings, they would hurt themselves as much as America. The debt relationship is more symbiotic than hostile. But technological dependencies are different. When China is the only country that can refine rare earths at scale, they have real leverage. When they dominate battery production, they can influence the pace of the electric vehicle transition. When they build the 5G networks, they have insight into how those networks operate. This shift happened because of deliberate strategic choices made over decades. China identified technologies that would be crucial to the future and invested systematically in dominating them. They were willing to subsidize industries for years, absorb losses, build overcapacity, whatever it took to become the essential supplier. America, meanwhile, optimized for short-term efficiency. If China could make solar panels cheaper, buy from China. If batteries cost less from Chinese suppliers, import from China. Each individual decision made economic sense. In aggregate, they created strategic vulnerability. There's an irony here. The United States spent much of the 20th century in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The defining characteristic of that conflict was that the two superpowers had as little economic interaction as possible. America and the Soviet Union didn't trade much, didn't invest in each other's economies, didn't build integrated supply chains. When tensions rose, it was relatively easy to decouple because they were never really coupled in the first place. The relationship with China is the opposite. The United States and China have built the most economically integrated relationship between major powers in world history. American companies manufacture in China. Chinese companies supply American industries. The supply chains for countless products crisscross the Pacific multiple times. This integration was supposed to make conflict unthinkable because both sides would lose so much from confrontation. But integration can also create asymmetric dependencies. If America needs Chinese rare earths more than China needs American debt, that's leverage. If American companies rely on Chinese batteries more than Chinese companies rely on American markets, that's vulnerability. Understanding this changes how we think about great power competition. The question isn't just who has the bigger military or economy, it's who controls the choke points in the technologies and materials that modern civilization depends on. China understood this early. Their Made in China 2025 plan explicitly targeted 10 high-tech sectors for dominance, including new energy vehicles, aerospace, telecommunications equipment, and advanced robotics. These weren't random choices. They were strategic selections of technologies that would be essential to future economic and military power. The plan called for 70% self-sufficiency in these sectors by 2025. The goal was not just to participate in these industries, but to control them, to have domestic supply chains that didn't depend on foreign suppliers, to be the supplier that other nations depended on. American policymakers are now scrambling to respond. The CHIPS Act allocated billions to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing. The Inflation Reduction Act included massive subsidies for solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles made in America. There are new restrictions on technology exports to China, particularly in advanced semiconductors and the equipment used to manufacture them. But rebuilding industrial capacity takes time. Training engineers takes time. Developing supply chains takes time. China has a 20-year head start in many of these technologies. They've built not just factories, but entire industrial ecosystems. They've educated a generation of engineers. They've established relationships with suppliers and customers worldwide. Consider semiconductors, the chips that power everything from phones to cars to weapon systems. The United States still leads in chip design. Companies like Intel, Nvidia, and Qualcomm are at the cutting edge of semiconductor innovation. But manufacturing those chips increasingly happens in Asia, particularly in Taiwan and South Korea. China is nowhere near the leader in advanced chip manufacturing. They're probably a decade behind the state of the art, but they're investing hundreds of billions to catch up, and they're making progress. Meanwhile, they dominate the older generation chips that go into cars, appliances, and industrial equipment. These aren't glamorous products, but they're essential, and there are shortages that have disrupted global supply chains. Here's what keeps American strategists up at night. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, makes about 90% of the world's most advanced chips. They're in Taiwan, an island that China claims as its own territory and has threatened to take by force. If China invaded Taiwan and gained control of TSMC, or if a conflict destroyed TSMC's facilities, the entire global tech industry would face a crisis that would make the pandemic supply chain disruptions look minor. The United States is trying to reduce this vulnerability by bringing advanced chip manufacturing back to America. TSMC is building new facilities in Arizona. Intel is investing in new factories. Samsung is building plants in Texas. But even with all this investment, it will take years to achieve anything close to self-sufficiency in advanced semiconductors. This is the new reality of great power competition. It's not just about military strength or economic size. It's about who controls the supply chains, the critical materials, the key technologies. It's about dependencies that took decades to develop and will take decades to unwind. There's a deeper question underneath all of this. Can America compete in this new landscape? The country that put men on the moon, that invented the internet, that created Silicon Valley, can it rebuild the manufacturing and supply chain capabilities it outsourced? The optimistic answer is that America still leads in innovation. American universities still produce cutting-edge research. American companies still develop revolutionary technologies. The challenge isn't invention, it's scaling up production and building supply chains. Those are solvable problems with enough investment and focus. The pessimistic answer is that America has spent 40 years optimizing its economy for different goals. Maximizing shareholder value, not strategic resilience. Just-in-time supply chains, not redundancy. Financial engineering, not manufacturing capability. Changing that orientation requires more than money. It requires changing incentives, corporate culture, and national priorities. What's certain is that the old framework for understanding US-China relations is inadequate. Talking about treasury bonds and trade deficits misses the more fundamental transformation. China isn't trying to own America's debt. They're trying to become indispensable to technologies that define modern civilization. And in many cases, they've succeeded. The next decade will determine whether the United States can adapt to this reality, whether it can rebuild domestic capacity in critical technologies, whether it can create alternative supply chains that don't run through China, whether it can compete not just in inventing new technologies, but in manufacturing them at scale. Because the lesson of rare earths, solar panels, batteries, and 5G is clear. Dependency isn't just about who owns whose bonds. It's about who controls the materials and technologies you cannot function without. And right now, for too many critical technologies, the answer is China. This is the real power shift of the 21st century. Not debt, but dependency. Not financial leverage, but technological control. The question is whether America recognizes this shift in time to do something about it, or whether we'll keep arguing about treasury bonds while China quietly becomes the gatekeeper to the future. This is John, and this is Inside the Global Economy. Subscribe now, because when this era is studied, only a few will be able to say they saw it coming.